The courthouse was busy on that Tuesday morning in Manchester. People hurried past the big stone building, some heading to court, others just tourists looking at the old architecture. Inside, courtroom number 4 was starting its morning session. Judge Margaret Wilson sat at her desk, straight and formal in her black robes. Her glasses sat on the edge of her nose as she read through the cases for the day. She had been a judge for 25 years, and mornings like this all felt the same to her now. Fine here, warning there, paperwork everywhere. Case number 37, said the clerk, James, a young man who had worked there for 5 years. City versus Emily Thompson. Illegal parking in a disabled space. A woman in her mid-30s walked to the front of the courtroom. She wore a simple black dress and carried a small bag. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and she moved with quiet confidence. Margaret glanced up, then back down at her notes. Emily Thompson? Margaret asked without looking up again. Yes, Your Honor, Emily replied. The charge is parking in a disabled space without proper permission. You were caught by the parking warden at 9:30 in the morning. The fine is £500. How do you plead? Emily took a breath. Your Honor, I'd like to explain the situation. Guilty or not guilty? Margaret interrupted. Not guilty, but I can explain. You can't be not guilty if you were observed parking there without the proper permit displayed, Margaret said sharply. She still hadn't really looked at Emily. The courtroom was warm and she wanted to finish these cases quickly. I had a temporary permit, Your Honor. It fell from the dashboard, Emily said calmly. I was loading equipment for the new community center project. I can show you photos of the permit and explain the circumstances. Margaret finally looked up. Her eyes were tired and her patience was thin. Everyone has a story, Ms. Thompson. The law doesn't care about circumstances. The permit wasn't visible. The fine stands. But, Your Honor, if I could just show you. £500, Margaret repeated. Pay within 30 days. Next case. Emily stood very still for a moment. Her hands gripped her bag tightly. Behind her, a few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. James, the clerk, gave her a sympathetic look but said nothing. Your Honor, Emily tried once more. I work with children in this community. I was setting up an art exhibition that helps kids express themselves. The equipment I was carrying was heavy, and that's why I parked close to the entrance. Margaret's gavel came down hard on the desk. Final warning, Ms. Thompson. The fine is £500. If you continue to argue, I'll charge you with contempt of court. Do you understand? Emily's shoulders slumped slightly. She nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Good. James. Next case. As Emily turned to leave, the morning sun came through the high windows. It lit up her face, showing the disappointment in her eyes. She walked out of the courtroom quietly, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The next person came forward. Another traffic violation. Margaret went through the same routine. Charge, plea, fine. Her mind was already on lunch and the afternoon cases. She didn't give Emily Thompson another thought. In the afternoon, the courthouse corridors buzzed with activity. Lawyers chatted, witnesses waited on benches, and families talked in hushed voices. In a small office down the hall, James was having tea with another court worker. That Emily Thompson case this morning, James said quietly. Judge Wilson was quite harsh, wasn't she? The other worker nodded. I recognized Emily. She's the artist who's been helping at the youth center. Does wonderful work with troubled teens. Uses art therapy, I believe. James sighed. Should I tell the judge? Better to leave it. You know how she gets when she thinks people are telling her how to do her job. Meanwhile, Emily was back at the community center, unloading her art supplies from her small car. Children ran around the courtyard, some calling out to her. She smiled at them, but her mind was still on the morning's events. Ms. Emily, called out a boy named Peter. Did you bring the paints? Yes, Peter. Help me carry them inside. Together they carried boxes of brushes, paints, and canvases. Emily had spent her own money on most of these supplies. The center didn't have much funding, but she believed in the project. These kids needed somewhere positive to go after school. Inside, The main hall was being transformed. Half-finished murals covered the walls. Children had painted their dreams, their fears, their hopes. Emily had started this project 6 months ago, and already she could see changes in the children. That evening, as Emily locked up the center, she thought about the morning. The £500 would be difficult to pay. Her teacher's salary wasn't large and she already spent so much on art supplies for the kids, but she wouldn't let it stop her work. She looked at the mural one more time before leaving. A group of children had painted hands holding hands, all different colors. Above it, they had written, "Everyone needs understanding." Emily smiled sadly. If only Judge Wilson had taken a moment to understand. If only she had looked beyond the paperwork to see the person standing before her. As she drove home that night, Emily wondered if things might have been different. But she pushed the thought away. Tomorrow was another day with new challenges and new opportunities. The children needed her, and that's what mattered most. Little did either woman know that their paths would cross again very soon, in a way that would change both their lives forever. The end Margaret Wilson's evening was just like any other. She arrived home to her quiet house on the outskirts of Manchester at 6 o'clock sharp. Her cat Thomas greeted her at the door. The house was large but empty. Her husband had passed away 5 years ago, and her 2 children lived in London with their own families. After feeding Thomas, Margaret sat in her study, reviewing files for tomorrow's cases. Her daughter Rebecca called while she was reading about a shoplifting case. "Mother, you're still coming to the mayor's charity dinner tomorrow night, aren't you?" Rebecca asked. Margaret sighed. These social events were tiresome. "Do I have to, dear? You know how I dislike these gatherings." "Mother, you promised. Besides, they're unveiling that new art installation everyone's talking about. The one at the Community Center. It's supposed to be amazing. The artist has done something really special with the space." "Very well. I'll be there," Margaret agreed reluctantly, "though I doubt some amateur artwork will be particularly interesting." "Don't be such a grump, Mother. It might surprise you. The artist's name is Emily Thompson, I think. She works with children from difficult backgrounds." Margaret paused. The name sounded familiar, but she dismissed it. Emily Thompson was probably a common name. The next evening, Margaret put on her navy blue dress and pearls. The charity dinner was being held at the Grand Hotel, a beautiful old building in the city center. When she arrived, the ballroom was full of Manchester's important people, councillors, business owners, and community leaders. "Margaret," called Mayor John Stevens, "so glad you could make it. Let me introduce you to some people who would love to meet you." Margaret smiled politely and shook hands with several people. She wasn't listening carefully until she heard them talking about art. "The transformation of the community center is extraordinary," said Mrs. Patricia Clark, who ran the local charity board. "You simply must see it. The artist has created something magical from recycled materials. She's given those children a voice." Margaret sipped her wine. "Who is this artist?" she asked, making conversation. "Emily Thompson. She's quite remarkable. Started as a teacher but found her calling in helping troubled youth through art therapy. She's become famous in our area for her community work." That name again. Margaret felt a small, uncomfortable feeling in her stomach, but she still didn't connect it to the woman from her courtroom. After dinner, the mayor stood up. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd all follow me, we're going to walk across the road to the community center for the unveiling." The group walked 2 blocks to the old building. Margaret had driven past it many times but had never been inside. They entered through a newly painted door, and immediately Margaret stopped in her tracks. The inside was completely transformed. What had once been a dreary space was now filled with color and life. Giant sculptures made from old metal scraps hung from the ceiling, telling stories. The walls displayed murals painted by children, each one more beautiful than the last. "This way, everyone." The mayor led them to the main hall. Margaret followed, still taking in all the artwork. She saw sculptures made from broken bottles turned into beautiful trees, paintings that showed children's faces, happy and full of hope. Everything seemed to tell a story of change and possibility. In the main hall, they faced a large curtain. Behind it was the special installation everyone had been talking about. "Before we unveil this masterpiece," the mayor said, "I want to introduce the artist who created all of this. Emily Thompson has spent 2 years turning this space into a beacon of hope for our children. Please welcome her." From the side of the stage, a woman emerged. Margaret's glass of water froze halfway to her lips. It was her. The woman from yesterday's courtroom. The one she had fined 500 pounds without listening. Emily walked to the microphone confidently, though Margaret noticed a moment when their eyes met. A flash of recognition and something else. Disappointment? Sadness? "Thank you for coming tonight," Emily began. "This installation represents the journey from darkness to light. It's about second chances and seeing beyond the surface. It's about understanding that every person has a story, worth hearing." As Emily spoke about her work, Margaret felt smaller and smaller. Yesterday, she had treated this woman as just another rule breaker. She hadn't seen the artist, the teacher, the community leader. She had only seen a parking violation. Emily continued talking about the children she worked with, how art helped them process their feelings and find hope. She explained how the installation was made from materials donated by local businesses and items the children had collected themselves. Margaret's hands trembled slightly. She remembered Emily trying to explain about her work, and Margaret cutting her off rudely. Then Emily pulled the cord, and the curtain fell away. Margaret gasped. Before them was a massive installation, hundreds of silver scales carefully balanced, representing justice. But what made it special was the additions. Between the scales were human figures, some small, representing children, others larger, representing adults. They were all connected by thin silver threads showing how people's lives touched each other. At the base of the installation were words in copper letters: "Justice sees best when it listens first." The crowd applauded enthusiastically. People moved forward to examine the details of the artwork, but Margaret remained still, those words echoing in her mind. "Incredible, isn't it?" Mrs. Clark said beside her. "Emily told us this piece was inspired by recent experiences with our legal system. She said sometimes we need to remind ourselves that behind every case is a human being." Margaret felt tears threatening to form in her eyes. This installation, this message, was directed at her, not in anger, but as a gentle reminder. Emily had taken yesterday's hurt and turned it into something beautiful and meaningful. She watched from across the room as Emily talked with the children who had helped create the artwork. Their faces glowed with pride and happiness. This was the woman Margaret had dismissed so quickly. Dr. Ross, a child psychologist, joined the conversation. "You know, Emily's program has reduced youth crime in our area by 30%. These children now have a safe place to go after school. They've learned to express themselves through art instead of destructive behavior." The mayor stood with Emily, praising her work. Emily Thompson received a national award last month for her community service. She's also advising the government on new programs for at-risk youth. Margaret felt a heavy weight in her chest. This woman wasn't just someone running a small art project. She was a respected leader in the community, making a real difference in children's lives. And Margaret had treated her as if she were nothing. As the evening wound down, Margaret watched Emily from a distance. Part of her wanted to approach and apologize immediately. Another part felt too ashamed to face the consequences of her behavior. Finally, she decided to leave. As she reached for her coat, Emily caught her eye across the room. For a moment, their gazes held. Emily gave a small, sad smile. It wasn't angry or accusing, it was understanding. That somehow made Margaret feel worse. Driving home through the dark streets of Manchester, Margaret kept seeing the installation in her mind. The scales of justice, connected by human threads. Justice sees best when it listens first. Tomorrow, she would have to sit in her courtroom again. How could she look at each case the same way now? How many stories had she cut short with her quick judgments? How many Emily Thompsons had stood before her, trying to be heard, only to be reduced to numbers and fines? When she arrived home, Thomas greeted her as usual. But tonight, Margaret couldn't concentrate on her files. Instead, she sat by the window, looking out at the city lights, thinking about the day she had already lived and the day she now had to face tomorrow. She knew something had changed in her heart. The question was, what was she going to do about it? The end Margaret arrived at the courthouse Friday morning with heavy thoughts. The night had been restless, filled with dreams of artistic scales and disappointed eyes. She went through her morning, routine mechanically, coffee, files, reading glasses, but her mind kept drifting to the installation she had seen. At 9 o'clock, James knocked on her office door. "Your Honor, might I have a word before court?" Margaret looked up from her desk. James seemed nervous, shifting from foot to foot. "What is it, James?" "It's about yesterday's case. Emily Thompson. I wanted you to know. She's quite well known. Around here. She runs the art therapy program at the community center. The kids she works with, many of them have been through your court before. Petty crimes, vandalism. But since they joined her program..." Margaret put down her pen. "Go on." "Well, the police say crime in that neighborhood has dropped significantly. The children who once caused trouble now spend their afternoons painting and creating. Emily doesn't judge them. She just helps them find better ways to express themselves." Margaret felt a tightness in her chest. "Why are you telling me this now, James?" James hesitated. "Because I think you should know. Everyone in this courthouse knows Emily. The other judges sometimes send young offenders to her program instead of jail. It works better than any punishment we could give them." After James left, Margaret sat in silence for a long moment. Then, she did something she hadn't done in years. She canceled her morning session. She told the clerk to reschedule all the cases for next week. She needed time to think. Margaret drove through the city streets, not really knowing where she was going. Eventually, she found herself near Emily's community center. She parked across the street and just watched. Children were arriving for their Friday afternoon art club. They carried school bags and excitement. She saw them wave to Emily, who stood by the door greeting each one. Some kids hugged her. Others showed her drawings from school. Emily treated each child like they were the most important person in the world. A police officer walked by and stopped to chat with Emily. Margaret recognized him, Officer Williams from the Youth Division. They talked for a few minutes, laughing, together. The officer turned to wave at some of the children, who waved back enthusiastically. Margaret realized these were the same children who, months ago, might have been running from the police. Now they waved and smiled. Emily had done this. She had changed their relationship with authority, with law, with community. Through the window, Margaret watched the art session begin. Emily helped a girl with her painting while other children worked on their own projects. The room glowed with afternoon sunlight. Paint jars lined the shelves. Half-finished sculptures stood in corners. This place was alive with creativity and second chances. An elderly man approached Emily's window. His clothes were worn, and he looked tired. Margaret watched as Emily welcomed him in, sat him down, and brought him tea. As he drank, Emily listened, patiently while he talked. After a while, she set up a canvas for him and encouraged him to paint. The man's hands shook, but Emily guided them gently. Soon, he was concentrating deeply on creating something. Margaret's phone rang. It was her, clerk, wondering when she would be back. "I'm taking a personal day," Margaret said quietly. She continued watching. Emily worked with each person there, children, teens, even a few adults who had wandered in. She never turned anyone away. She saw potential where others saw problems. Around 5 o'clock, as the center began to close, Margaret saw Emily speak privately with a young boy. His shoulders were slumped. Emily knelt to his level, holding his hands and speaking earnestly. The boy nodded, tears in his eyes. Then Emily hugged him, and for a moment, they just stayed like that. When they separated, the boy was smiling again. That image stayed with Margaret as she drove home. A simple hug had changed that child's whole afternoon. Such a small gesture, but it meant everything to him. That evening, Margaret called her daughter Rebecca. "I need to tell you about something that happened," Margaret began, then explained the whole story. The courtroom scene, the installation, her realization. Rebecca listened quietly. "Mother, this is the most honest I've heard you be in years. Usually you're so certain, so rigid. What's changed?" "I saw what I couldn't see before," Margaret said. "I saw what happens when someone actually listens, when someone believes in people instead of just judging them." "So what will you do now?" Margaret had been thinking about this all day. "I need to make things right. But first, I need to understand how wrong I was." The next morning, Margaret did something she had never done in her career. She went to the courthouse early and found the files of all the cases Emily had mentioned in court. Cases where young people had been sent to her art program instead of detention. The records were remarkable. First offenders who had been given a chance in Emily's program, 90% never reoffended. Those who stayed with the program for 6 months showed improvement in school, better family relationships, increased self-esteem. Judge Harrison, an older colleague, found her reading the files. "Ah, discovering Emily's magic, are you?" He smiled kindly. "She's changed my whole approach to youth justice. Sometimes the best punishment is opportunity." "How do you decide who to send there?" Margaret asked. "I look at the whole person, not just the crime. First-time offenders, children from difficult homes, those who show even a spark of remorse. Emily works wonders with them all." That afternoon, Margaret made a decision. Monday morning, she would find Emily and apologize properly. But before that, she would do something else. She called her secretary and arranged for a meeting with the chief judge. She had a proposal about reforming how they handled youth cases. That Sunday evening, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. Emily Thompson stood at her door, holding a small canvas. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Emily said politely. "I wanted to return the courtroom sketches I made during my appearance. I thought perhaps you'd want to see how our encounter looked through my eyes." Margaret invited her in. Over tea, they spoke for the first time as people, not as judge and defendant. Emily shared the painting. It showed Margaret at her bench, but surrounded by shadows. In the corner of the canvas, nearly invisible, were small faces of children, watching from the edges. "Is this how you saw me that day?" Margaret asked quietly. "You seemed lost in the shadows of procedure," Emily said gently, unable to see the people waiting to be heard. Margaret felt tears again. "I was. I am. But I want to change." They talked long into the evening. Emily told stories about the children she worked with, how art helped them process trauma, build confidence, find purpose. Margaret talked about her fears of being too soft, of letting people down. "Justice isn't about being soft or hard," Emily said. "It's about being fair. And fairness requires understanding the whole story." When Emily left that night, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years, hope that she could be better. Monday morning, Margaret entered her courtroom differently. Before the first case, she made an announcement. "From today forward, this court will implement new procedures for first-time youth offenders. We will consider alternative sentencing options that address underlying issues. We will listen to complete circumstances before making decisions." James smiled from his clerk's desk. In the gallery, several regular attendees looked surprised. Change had come to courtroom number 4. And somewhere across town, Emily Thompson began her morning art session, unaware that her simple dignity had started a revolution in how justice was served. The end 2 months passed quickly after Margaret's visit to Emily's community center. The new programs she had introduced were already showing results. Young people who would once have received just fines or detention now had options to choose rehabilitation through community service or art therapy. One rainy Tuesday morning, Margaret entered her courtroom with renewed purpose. James greeted her with a smile, which was becoming more common these days. "Busy morning ahead, Your Honor," he said. "And there's one case that might interest you especially. A young man named Thomas Bradley. First offense, vandalism on public property." Margaret nodded, These cases now required extra attention, extra care. She had learned to ask the right questions, to look deeper than the surface. When Thomas was called forward, Margaret saw a scared, 16-year-old with shaking hands. His mother sat in the gallery wringing her hands nervously. "Thomas, you're charged with spray painting offensive words on the playground wall at St. Mary's School. Do you admit to this?" "Yes, Your Honor," he mumbled. "Would you like to tell me why you did this?" Thomas looked up, surprised by the question. Most judges never asked why. I was angry. The other kids at school, they make fun of me because my dad's in prison. They say I'll end up just like him." Margaret felt a familiar pang in her chest. 6 months ago, she would have simply imposed a fine and moved on. Now she saw the pain behind the act. "That must be very difficult for you," she said gently. "Have you ever done anything like this before?" "No, Your Honor. I usually keep to myself, but that day they just wouldn't stop." Margaret reviewed his file. Clean record, good grades despite missing some school. She noticed a scholarship application for art classes had been denied due to lack of family funds. "Thomas, I'm going to offer you 2 choices. You can pay a fine of £300, which I understand would be difficult for your family. Or you can complete 30 hours of community service at the Art Therapy Center on Park Street." Thomas's eyes widened. He had heard about that place. Some of his friends went there. "The Art Center, Your Honor?" "Yes. You'll work directly with Ms. Emily Thompson, helping younger children with their art projects. You'll also clean up the graffiti you created and help paint a new mural in its place. What do you choose?" Thomas looked at his mother, who nodded eagerly. "I choose the Art Center, Your Honor." "Then it's settled. Report to Ms. Thompson next Saturday at 9 o'clock. James will provide you with all the details." After court, Margaret made a phone call she wouldn't have made 6 months ago. She called Emily directly to discuss Thomas's case. "He's a good kid who made a bad choice," Emily said after Margaret explained. "We get many like him. Art gives them a way to channel their anger into something positive. I've assigned him 30 hours. Is that reasonable?" "Perfect. By then, he'll likely want to stay longer. They usually do." 2 weeks later, while reviewing her cases, Margaret received an unexpected email. It was from Emily, with a photograph attached. The picture showed a beautiful mural on the school wall. Bright colors depicted children playing together, words of encouragement painted in swirling letters. At the bottom corner in small neat writing, "Painted by Thomas Bradley and the Park Street Art Club." The email read, "Thomas came in angry. Now he comes in smiling. He wants to apply to art college. Thank you for giving him this chance. Emily." Margaret printed the email and kept it in her desk drawer. These small victories meant more than any legal judgment she had ever written, but bigger changes were coming. The chief judge had noticed the success of Margaret's new approach. Youth crime rates in cases from her courtroom had dropped by 40%. Repeat offenses were down by half. One Friday afternoon, the chief judge called Margaret to his office. "Judge Wilson, your methods are getting attention. The Ministry of Justice wants a report on your youth rehabilitation program. They're considering implementing it citywide." Margaret felt a mix of pride and nervousness. "It's not just my program, sir. It's really Emily Thompson and her colleagues who do the real work. I just connect troubled young people with the right resources. Nevertheless, you've changed the entire philosophy of youth justice in this courthouse. I'd like you to lead a task force to expand the program." That evening, Margaret called Emily with the news. They were now official partners in reforming how the court system handled young offenders. "We should celebrate," Emily suggested. "Bring your daughter Rebecca to the center tomorrow. We're having our monthly art show. The children would love to meet you both." The next day, Margaret and Rebecca visited the community center. They found the space transformed by dozens of artworks, each telling a personal story. Parents, neighbors, and supporters filled the rooms. Thomas approached them, confidently. "Your Honor, I'm so glad you came. Wait till you see what I made." He led them to a large painting of a courtroom. But this courtroom had open windows, sunlight streaming in, and people of all ages working together. "It's how I see justice now," Thomas explained. Not separate from the community, but part of it. Emily joined them. Thomas has been accepted to the city art program. Full scholarship. He starts in September. Margaret looked at Emily with deep gratitude. This woman had shown her a better way to serve justice, not through punishment, alone, but through understanding and opportunity. As they walked through the exhibition, Margaret noticed changes in herself too. She laughed more easily. She listened more carefully. She saw people instead of just cases. Even Rebecca noticed. "Mother, you seem lighter somehow. Happier than I've seen you in years." Later that afternoon, as they prepared to leave, a small girl approached Margaret. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. She handed Margaret a drawing. It showed a woman in black robes, but instead of looking stern, she was smiling and surrounded by colorful stars. "For the nice judge," the girl said shyly. Emily translated, "She's one of our youngest artists. Her brother was in your court last month. You sent him to us instead of detention. He's doing wonderfully now." The girl's smile was pure sunshine. Margaret carefully folded the drawing and placed it in her handbag. It would go into her desk drawer with all the other reminders of why this work mattered. As they left the center, Margaret felt the warm sun on her face. Manchester still had its gray days, but somehow the world seemed more colorful now. She had found purpose again, not despite her work, but because of how she chose to do it. That Monday, she would begin training other judges in the new approach. Emily would be her co-presenter. Together, they would spread the message: justice without compassion is just another form of injustice. The end 6 months after their first meeting in the courtroom, Emily Thompson stood at a podium in the Manchester Conference Center. She was addressing a gathering of judges, social workers, and community leaders from across the country. Her voice was steady as she spoke about second chances and transformation. "Change begins with a single moment of understanding," Emily said. "6 months ago, I faced a judge who saw only my actions, not my circumstances. Today, I stand here with that same judge as my colleague and friend." Margaret Wilson sat in the front row, listening to Emily's words. The conference was showcasing their joint program, which had already been adopted by 5 other courts in England. The Minister of Justice had sent a representative to observe. After Emily finished her speech, Margaret joined her on stage. Together, they presented the program's results: a 75% reduction in youth repeat offenses, increased school attendance among program participants, and family reunification success stories. During the coffee break, numerous judges approached Margaret with questions. The atmosphere was electric with possibility. Change was spreading beyond Manchester. Later that afternoon, they returned to Emily's Art Center for a special ceremony. The mayor had declared it a community excellence center, providing permanent funding and expansion space. Children's artwork lined the walls, each piece telling a story of healing and hope. Thomas Bradley, now 18 and enrolled in art college, had organized a surprise. With other program graduates, he had created a massive mural spanning the entire back wall of the main room. It depicted the journey from judgment to understanding, a visual representation of what had happened between Margaret and Emily. As the paint covers came off, revealing the magnificent artwork, Margaret felt tears welling up. The mural showed 2 women standing together, one in judicial robes, one in an artist's apron, surrounded by children of all backgrounds working on creative projects. Above them, in bold letters, "Justice sees best when it listens first. This is our gift to you both," Thomas announced. "You changed our lives by changing yourselves first." The ceremony continued with speeches from former program participants. Sophie, now 16, talked about how art therapy helped her deal with her mother's illness. Michael, 17, described how painting helped him process his anger about his father's abandonment. "Judge Wilson used to scare me," Michael admitted, "but she gave me a choice when I didn't think I had any. Ms. Thompson helped me find something good inside myself." During the reception, Margaret's family arrived: Rebecca, her son James from London, and even her 2 granddaughters. They were meeting Emily for the first time, though they had heard countless stories about her. Rebecca pulled Emily aside. "Thank you for giving my mother back her heart," she whispered. "For years, she was just going through the motions. Now she has purpose." Again, as the day wound down, Margaret and Emily found themselves alone in the art room. Easels stood ready for tomorrow's session. Paint pots waited to be filled with new colors. "You know," Margaret said softly, "that day in court, I was caught in my own prison. Rules and procedures had become walls around my heart." Emily smiled. "And now look at you, leading nationwide reform, speaking at conferences, connecting with people you once only saw as case numbers. I couldn't have done it without your patience and forgiveness," Margaret replied. "When you handed me that painting that night, showing me surrounded by shadows, it was like looking in a mirror for the first time in years." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Emily spoke again. "The funny thing is that £500 fine became the best thing that ever happened to us both. You found your true calling and our center got national attention." Margaret laughed. "I never thought I'd say this, but thank goodness for that illegal parking ticket." Their laughter echoed through the room, bouncing off walls decorated with hope and healing. A year later, on the anniversary of their first courtroom encounter, Margaret made a special ruling. She formally dismissed Emily's parking ticket, replacing it with a citation for outstanding community service. The courtroom erupted in applause.